In this video, I'm going to show you how to place the front brakes on this two-wheel drive Toyota Tacoma. Let's get started. Let's remove the wheel. You can either use a thin wall 21mm socket or use a little pry bar screwdriver. Pull this cap off. Now you can use a regular size socket to get all the 5 21mm lug nuts off. With those off, remove the wheel. Let's separate the caliper from its bracket so we can remove the pads. There are two 17mm headed slider pin bolts here. However, the top one, the brake line is going to be in the way. Don't bend it or anything like that. I'll show you a trick. Let's remove this bottom one, 17mm socket. Once you break this free, you can slide this out. And with that set aside, open the caliper up like a clamshell, and once it's open, you can slide the top slider pin out of the bracket, leave it on the caliper, take the caliper, set it aside right here. You can tie it with something, but this is fairly secure while we work. You just don't want to put any pressure on this brake hose. Take the pads out. Now use a 17mm socket and remove the two bolts that hold the caliper bracket onto the knuckle. Leave this one in a few threads so that it can hold the caliper bracket while you remove the lower one. Now take both off and remove your caliper bracket. Now we have to remove this cap. You can either use some pliers and just grab it like this, or tap a chisel in there, but usually that bends it. So if you can get it with pliers, wiggle it back and forth, pop it off. Now let's remove the cotter pin. Straighten it out, push it through. I like to just grab it with some cutters, use this to pry on, and kind of pull it out. There we go. Discard this, don't reuse the cotter pins. Remove this cap. I like to clean it out, inspect it, make sure it's still in good condition. Clean off the mounting nut area. And then I'm not going to remove anything just yet. What I like to do on these is I like to mark where it is located currently. And that is because I know that the adjustment on this bearing, or on these bearings on the hub, is done right. So I'd like to get it back to where it was, or at least have a reference point. That way I know how far off I am when I reinstall it. So what I'm going to do is take a punch and a hammer, and I'm just going to make a little mark here at the top. You can see there's a slit on the spline, or on the spindle. I'm going to just make a line with my chisel. There we go. There we go. So that, I made myself a little arrow here. And at this point, usually you could just get it by hand, but sometimes you might need pliers. These should not be tight at all though. If they are tight, they are over tightened. Take this off. Now, there we go. Push this out. Get the this little spacer plate off, washer, and the outer bearing. Sometimes these get stuck just from the grease sticking to them. Take this off. Now, let's remove this. Once this is off, inspect everything. At this point, if you wanted to install a new seal, you can. If yours is in good condition, reuse it. Let's get the rotor off. There are 5 14mm headed bolts going through this hub onto the rotor. We have to remove these in order to get the rotor off. Try to make sure that you don't get any debris inside this. You can cap it off with a rag if you want to, or you could put that cap back on. I'm just going to be careful not to get debris in there, otherwise you'll have to clean out that grease. If you don't have an impact to do this, once the hub and everything is off the vehicle, you can do this while it's on the vehicle, break them free, and then remove them now. At this point, the rotor should come down. It is fairly stuck on here, so what I'm going to do is take a hammer, tap it down. It's supposed to slide off of the hub, but a lot of times it gets seized on here. it goes. Remove the hub and set it aside carefully so that you don't get a bunch of debris on the grease. And now you can remove your rotor. I'm going to use this clean rag and stuff it in here to avoid potential debris getting in here, because at this point, this being so dirty, I need to clean this all up. There's a rust ridge here. I don't want the new rotor to seize on there, and obviously I want it to slide on smoothly. So I'm going to start by just scraping all of this old gunky dirt, grease-infused dirt off of here. You want a nice clean surface. Don't worry about degreasing it. A little bit of leftover oil and grease isn't going to do any bad to it. But what I'm worried about is this ridge. If the rotor doesn't sit completely flat on this, it will be offset and you'll have braking issues. So now that I wiped it, I can see what's happening. I'm going to take a wire brush and go around the whole area. If a wire brush doesn't do it for you, you're going to have to sand it down, use a wire wheel on a drill, whatever it takes. Just get it nice and clean. Doesn't have to look perfect, but remove all the rust so the rotor can slide on. Another thing I want to do is remove this ridge that has built up along each of these bolt holes. And the reason for that is if the new rotor is not perfectly positioned, it can sit on this ridge. Therefore, it'll be slightly offset. You can use a flat file, a sanding block, whatever you have. Just get it flat so that there's no potential for any misalignment. I'm going to wipe everything off. That way there's no dust. If you want to rinse it with brake parts cleaner, go ahead, but make sure you don't get it inside where the grease is, of course. And now I'd like to coat it with some anti-seize, just so we can prevent rust from building up here in the future. You don't want it to swell up or the rotor getting stuck on here. When you apply this, you don't need a lot, just a thin layer. I'm going to kind of spread it out everywhere, as well as on this ridge here where the rotor sits. This is most likely where it's going to seize on if it does, just on the center part here. So just give it a nice thin layer all the way around. If you put too much, it's actually going to start flinging out as you drive. It'll get on your wheel, and you want to avoid that. There we go. Take your rotor, slide it over. Of course, make sure the bolt holes line up, and you're going to have to start in one bolt. I'm going to hold it this way so the rotor doesn't fall, otherwise it'll be fairly difficult to line up. As soon as one is started, looks like this one just started in, I can flip it over and do the rest of my job. There we go. Now it should stay. And just start in the rest of the bolts. Oops, it fell, but it didn't fall off completely. Grab your 14mm socket, just snug them all up in a cross pattern so the rotor can seat properly. I'm holding it so that it's fully seated. Now that it's seated, I can let go. I'm not going to torque these yet, just because it'll be difficult and it's going to wobble all over the place. I'll take care of this once it's on the vehicle, but for now these are snug. Now the caliper bracket has to be cleaned up and re-lubricated. I know this one looks like it's brand new, so there isn't a whole lot for me to clean, but if it's a used caliper bracket, of course, more than likely it will need some cleaning. Pop off the anti-rattle clips, set those aside. And now what I'm going to do is take a clean rag and just wipe off all of the grease that's here, if there is any left. At this point, you would typically take a wire brush and clean everything off. I mean, this one is pretty much spotless. There isn't much for me to clean. Sometimes you'll need to sand things down. I'll be very gentle if you do that. Try to use something that's not super abrasive because you don't want to remove material. Then there will be too much space here for the pads. What you want to do is just get it nice and flat. What you can also do is use a flat file. File this down. Basically, just get it nice and clean. Once you do that, apply a very thin layer of silicone paste or brake grease if that's what you have. Anything that is resistant to higher temperatures is basically what you're looking for, so it doesn't melt as the brakes heat up. Apply it all over here. If you put too much, it's actually a bad thing because it'll squeeze out and get onto the area where the rotor goes in the middle here. Now you'd want to take the anti-rattle clips, make sure it's the right side, One side will have a little spring retainer, a spring hook to it. The other side is going to be flat. Put the spring side on first, and you're going to want to push it and clip it up and over. You want to make sure that this is fully seated and flat. If it's not fully seated, it can fall off and the pad won't sit in here right. So at this point, let's do the same to the other side. Inspect your caliper slider bores. This one's a new caliper, so I'm not too worried about it. If you had seized pins in here, you're going to want to send a bore brush through. Take the boot off, send a bore brush through, inspect the boot. If it's in good condition, you can reuse it. If not, you're going to want to replace it. Add some grease to the boot. What this does is it will act as a reserve of grease as the brakes function. Over time, it will need to stay lubricated. So I'm going to add a little bit to both. If there's too much, it'll actually just squeeze out when you put the pins in, so it's not that big of a deal, but it's just a waste of grease. So once you put in a little bit of grease here, wipe off any excess, and now this is going to be ready to be reinstalled on the truck. Apply some grease to the spindle. That way it's greased up, ready to go. Right here where the seal rides. That way it slips right on and seats itself properly. You don't need to overpack this. Now take your hub with the rotor, slide it all on. Make sure it seats itself all the way. Take the outer bearing, slide it in. There we go. This washer has a little notch, has to line up with the cut. Then I'll take the spindle nut, line it up. Since I have a mark on it, I'm just going to bring it close. Okay, did that. Now I can let go of it, and the hub will stay on here. I'm going to just clean off the top of the nut here so I can see my mark. And then I will grab it with some pliers at this point. Now you can either use a socket or some pliers, and the way you want to adjust this hub is tighten it up a little extra. This is my mark here, that's the line. Tighten it up extra, make it snug. Give this a few spins. This is going to seat those bearings. Snug it up a little more. It should let you. The more they seat, the more you should be able to snug it up. Obviously, we're not going to leave it like this. This would be over tightened, as you can see. It almost feels like there are brakes dragging. So at this point, you'd want to release it until you feel that it is spinning freely with minimal resistance, but you don't want to loosen it too much to where it has a lot of play and it's just spinning like this. And if you can hear the wheel bearing like this, that's way too loose. You need to tighten that up to where they're quiet with minimal drag. So right about here, I can see my mark is here, the spline or the cutout is here, so I'm very close to how it was before, but you don't have to be spot on, you just have to feel it out. You can always readjust this if you believe that it's not right, but this should be good to go. Let's lock this in. If this doesn't line up with the hole for the cotter pin, just keep spinning it until it does. There we go. One of the slots will line up. These are all offset on purpose. Slide a new cotter pin through and bend it over to lock it in. When you bend it over, make sure it goes all the way so that the cap can fit over. Speaking of cap, take this, tap it on. Don't tap it too hard, you don't want to bend it. I'm going to clean the rotor now. You want to make sure that there are no fingerprints, oils, grease, whatever. Get it all off of there. You don't want anything contaminating the braking surface. Use brake parts cleaner and a clean rag. And do the same on the back side. There we go. Let's put the caliper bracket on, line it up with the bolt holes, start them in by hand. There we go. Bottom these out. .80 foot-pounds is the torque for both of these bolts. Let's install the pads. Make sure they slide on smoothly. If they don't, you most likely didn't clean up the caliper bracket enough and they're getting crushed in between the two ends. So you want to take this off and clean it, otherwise the pads will get stuck as they operate. This slider pin that never came off of the caliper, you want to inspect it. The other one you can, hold and inspect. But this one, do your best. It should be good. Usually, unless they seize up, they're still in good condition. Wipe it off. I'm going to add a thin layer of silicone paste to this, or brake grease if that's what you're using. The other one, I will wait until it goes in to add silicone paste. A thin layer is all you need. If you put too much, it's actually just going to get wiped off as you insert it through the boot. And that's just a waste of grease, but it also can get everywhere and you don't want it to contaminate brake pads or the brake rotor. So this is all I'm going to do for now. The rest of the grease should already be in the boot. My caliper might not push back much because it's fairly new, but at this point you would want to use a caliper depression tool and press the piston of the caliper back in to accommodate for the thicker new pads. Go ahead until it bottoms out completely, which is right about here. Perfect. Take your tool out. We're ready to install. Take your caliper, slide the top slider pin through carefully, and then bring it down and over. Make sure this boot doesn't get pinched. Line it up. Put the lower slider pin in. This one you can thread on. This is a 17 millimeter in size, so let's just bottom it out. Snug it, and the torque is 65 foot-pounds. That's it. When it comes to the boot, you want to make sure that it is seated properly on the pin. These are threads right here, so it doesn't need to go all the way in, but the boot has to sit on that lip of the pin. Also, if you take a little pocket screwdriver and open it up just a tiny bit, it'll release any air that's trapped in there, as well as any excess grease. You can also take the boot off of the end of the slider pin bore. That'll do the same thing. Mine looks good. I'm going to check the top one, but this is what you want to definitely check. Otherwise, if it's not seated, water gets in here and will seize up your pin. Let's torque these, 40 foot-pounds. Hold the hub with a pry bar while you torque it. If you're unable to torque them, just do your best and snug them up. I'm going to torque these in a cross pattern. That way, if for some reason the rotor isn't seated 100%, it will now. Okay. I'm just going to go in a circle and double check them all. I know I already skipped one, but I'll get to it. There it was. That's tight. Got the wheel back on. Start on all 5 of your lug nuts, bottom them out in a cross pattern, and then also in a cross pattern, tighten them to 83 foot-pounds. Once again, 83 foot-pounds for all these lug nuts in a cross pattern. And if your truck had the center caps, go ahead and put these back on.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.